Kirby. He's the name that you know. This cute pink devourer of worlds has been part of Nintendo's lineup since his inception on the original Game Boy with Kirby's Dreamland. Since then, Kirby has had many adventures spanning many console generations, from the Game Boy family, to the NES, to the Super Nintendo, to the Nintendo 64. After the release of Kirby 64 in 2000, fans were eager to hear when they could play Kirby's next great adventure. Unfortunately, little did they know that they would need to wait for 11 years when, after a very long hiatus, Kirby's Return to Dreamland was finally released in 2011, with general praise from both hardcore Kirby fans and critics alike. With the game taking 11 years to develop, even to the point where it skips the entire Gamecube generation, it's pretty understandable to question how this new modern Kirby game came to be. And with such a robust new modern twist on Kirby, what kind of stuff is hidden within its game files? So, today in the beta files, in celebration of Kirby's 30th anniversary, and as suggested by this Dreamlander who's a fan of cake, I'll be taking a look at Kirby's Return to Dreamland on the Nintendo Wii. Kirby's Return to Dreamland would be developed at Kirby's birthplace and Nintendo's second-party developer, HAL Laboratory. Development had just wrapped up on Kirby 64 The Crystal Shards, but the team wanted to start right away on a new mainline Kirby game for the Nintendo Gamecube, or Project Dolphin as it was known at the time. During this time, producer Shigefumi Kawase, known for his work as a designer in Pokemon Snap, his supervision on many of the modern Kirby games, and, as of the making of this video, the current president of HAL Laboratory itself, became the head of this project. He wanted to focus on appeasing the fans, while also innovating on the Kirby formula for this new game. But development became very stagnant under this direction, as the entire team felt that simple mechanics such as movement didn't feel right, and even the attempt of trying to surprise fans with more innovative gameplay wasn't working. During this tumultuous time in development, the team had somehow created 3 different Kirby game prototypes. One of the prototypes, which would later be shown off at E3 2005, was based off of 4-player simultaneous gameplay. This version of the game never reached completion, as Kawase quickly learned that making a multiplayer game was not the same as making a single-player game, and vice versa, so it was eventually dropped. The next prototype was a more drastic change for the series, that set Kirby in an open environment with full 3D movement. Ultimately, the game did not reach the level of quality the development team yearned for, and it was eventually dropped too. The idea of a full 3D Kirby game would not leave the minds at HAL Laboratory though, as the idea would later be revisited in Planet Robobot in the minigame Kirby 3D Rumble on the 3DS, and even into an official game with Kirby and the Forgotten Land on the Nintendo Switch. The last prototype that the team tried to bring into fruition was akin to Kirby's 2D roots, with a pop-up book art style. It's said by Kawase that they renewed the copyability system and tried to power it up in this game, which sounds like an early attempt at the super ability concept. But this prototype also never reached full completion and was scrapped yet again. As the development hell raged inside of HAL Laboratory, news of a new Kirby game was already announced in 2004, with many enthusiastic about Kirby's next outing on the new Nintendo Gamecube. Nintendo also dropped a tidbit of detail that this new Kirby game would be playable up to 4 players. A year went by, and this new supposed Kirby game was shown off at E3 2005, with a trailer showing off many different mechanics such as the 4-player feature and many new copy abilities for Kirby to acquire. Elements of the story were also hinted at this E3, with another trailer that was shown off on the show floor. However, this would be the last time Nintendo showed off the game, as the Big N went radio silent after E3 2005. As we know now, HAL Laboratory was in quite of a serious development conundrum at this point, but as far as the public could see at the time, all they knew was that the game was still being developed in some capacity, as the game kept on showing up in various Nintendo-related reports. Now, from my research via looking up some public magazine archives on the Internet Archive and Retro Mags, according to what has been publicly archived as of the making of this video, by the November 2006 issue of Nintendo Power, the game had disappeared completely from the Game Watch forecast list. And even when the magazine added in the Wii category in the December 2006 issue, it still did not appear and seemed to have vanished altogether. Despite this disappearance to the American audience, Nintendo of Japan had kept the game up on its Japanese release list year after year from 2005 all the way until 2008. Now, back to the unexpected development turmoil in HAL Laboratory. The year is 2010, and director Shinya Kumazaki, known for his work on Kirby Superstar Ultra and nearly every single Kirby game up until the date of this video, had just become involved in the project. The third Kirby prototype had just been cancelled, and Kumazaki had been watching the whole development and cancellation from the sidelines, as he was working on a different project before his involvement. Once he became director, Kumazaki was told that he had a year and a half to complete the project, which he accepted wholeheartedly, thinking his experience with Kirby Superstar Ultra might just be the thing he needs to get this project finally moving. Since there were 3 different Kirby prototypes that were partially completed, he felt that he needed to restrict himself a bit from changing, taking apart, or remaking aspects from the prototypes too much in order to not disrespect the 10 years of previous work the other teams had already done. Other members of HAL would eventually join Kumazaki in the hopes of finally getting a new Kirby game created, including programming director Hiraoki Nakano, who would later be working on the future Kirby games as well as the Box Boy games for the 3DS, design leader Tadashi Kamitake, who worked on Kirby Superstar Ultra, and producer Hitoshi Yamagami, whose works include Dr. Mario, Pokemon Puzzle League, and Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and 2. Oh, and he eventually got Yuri Hattori, whose works include the 3DS Kirby games and Animal Crossing New Horizons, and Kazuhiro Yoshikawa, whose works include New Super Mario Bros. 2 and Miitopia, for assistance later down the line. The reason why I'm introducing these people now is because many of their development stories merge together, so bear with me as I try to tie those stories into one cohesive timeline. When Yamagami was brought on board, this was the first Kirby game that he became a part of, and decided to start by looking at the 3 prototypes to determine why they were cancelled. His conclusion was, well, he couldn't find a conclusive reason, so he just gave up on trying to find it, and just decided to work with what they had. He would then ask Hattori and Yoshikawa for assistance in creating this game with him, and they went to HAL's higher management to convince them that they wanted to finally complete a new home console Kirby game. With the approval of the higher-ups, official meetings for the development of the game started in March 2010, with the dev team given a supposed deadline of August or September of 2011. Yamagami and his team also stated to the devs to, and I quote, "make a single-player game." While the producers wanted to make a 4-player game from the outset, they thought that this approach would be a burden to the entire Kirby team. So they decided to have the devs focus solely on the single-player aspect, and then slowly introduce the 4-player concept later on. For Nakano and his programming team, creating the game based on single-player gameplay was pretty much smooth sailing for them. Basic copy abilities and the basic movement mechanics of Kirby were easy to program, as the 3 prototypes had given the team a solid foundation on how they should work. One of the requests that was sent to the programmers was to keep the upgraded abilities aspect from one of the prototype games. While the experimentation phase of the mechanic was already completed in the 3rd prototype, the actual implementation into gameplay hadn't been done yet, so this was the first thing that the programmers tackled after finishing basic Kirby gameplay. It ended up being a bit of a hassle to create super ability versions of all of the copy abilities, so the programmers instead decided to cut down on how many super abilities there were, and focus instead on the power and surprise the abilities gave to players. Meanwhile, Kamitake, who was also managing schedules alongside his designing supervision duties, went over to Nintendo's headquarters in Kyoto for a scheduled meeting with Satoru Iwata. The point of this meeting was to actually schedule another meeting with veteran development team members of the Kirby series. See, the Return to Dreamland development team knew how to develop a Kirby game, but were clueless as to what specific direction the game needed to go towards. This roundtable discussion with the veterans would not only establish what kind of direction the game should take, but also settle down the worries that the veterans and the development team themselves both had for this game. Now with a clear focus, and the grace of the veterans of games past, development of the game started ramping up around October 2010. The development team grew exponentially, and with that came the idea of making an in-house website for better coordination in all departments, in terms of how much the game was progressing. According to Kumazaki, this website was created due to the harsh development issues that plagued the 3 prototype Kirby games, as past development members didn't know how far along the entire game was in development. The website was created as a response to this lack of synergy, which contained screenshots depicting the history of the development, reports on the current status in a blog type of format, and possibly some type of open forum, where developers could post specifications they were thinking about, or artwork that was made by the various artists within the team. This development diary was updated on a daily basis, and excited many of the development members as to how far they were progressing. The game was smoothly chugging along the supposed release date when, one day, as Yamagami and Hattori were taking the 4-hour train ride to work, they discussed about finally bringing up the 4-player concept to the dev team. Yamagami stated that he wanted Kirby playable with all 4 players, but Hattori stated that the chaos might be a bit much for players to handle at first. They would compromise on the plan. by having 3 players be different characters entirely, and that if the game turned out fun with these characters, then they would bring up making Kirby playable with all 4 players. Once they talked to Nakano and his dev team, they exclaimed, "We were talking about how we'd like to do that." So the dev team got to work on creating the 4-player system and implementing the new characters in the form of King Dedede, Meta Knight, and Bandana Waddle Dee. The real challenge was making the 4 Kirbys work in tandem at the same time, as simultaneous Kirbys using copy abilities, plus the ability to drop in and out of gameplay caused issues, suddenly disappearing from the screen after joining mid-game being one of the big hurdles. But with persistence and many nights spent at HAL's offices, the programmers were able to iron out the kinks. So where was Kumazaki at this point? Well, he was busy with supervising duties nearly on a day-to-day basis, but he did find time to help out the project in meaningful ways. For instance, Kumazaki spent most of his weekends at HAL Laboratory just brainstorming and developing new ideas with other HAL members who also came on the weekends. One weekend saw Kumazaki and a former co-worker discussing new ideas. We don't know the name of this co-worker, as Kumazaki never states a name, but we do know that he worked with Kumazaki on the last boss in Kirby's Canvas Curse. So they were discussing various ideas, and the programmer suggested an idea where Kirby's inhale was stronger. As in, instead of Kirby inhaling one object or enemy, this stronger version of the inhale would be able to swallow big enemies, multiple objects, and even other players and spit them out in a giant projectile. As you can guess, this idea struck a chord with Kumazaki and gave birth to Kirby's Super Inhale ability that would be introduced in Return to Dreamland. These weekends were also the source of various multiplayer elements of the game, like the Cracklers or the Stomper boots that you can acquire, as Kumazaki wanted the game to focus more on the multiplayer aspect at times, and their inspiration came from various events in Japanese variety shows. Kumazaki had also somehow found time to help in the game's level design, while supervising everyone. Nearly all of the core elements of each level came from one designer, with Kumazaki watching him and giving him live feedback on each level, with a handful of supporting level designers for backup. The reason why it was mainly these two was simply because they had offices right next to each other in HAL Laboratory, and it made it easier for them to go back and forth in between each other's work for designing and inspecting purposes. The public would finally get a glimpse of a new Kirby game being released for the Wii in Nintendo's financial relations briefing in January of 2011. While these briefings are mostly targeted towards investors and those working in the financial department, these briefings are also the source of many games being planned for release within the coming months. This briefing in particular had the reveals of Pandora's Tower, what would become Rhythm Heaven Fever, and of course, a new Kirby game being in the works, alongside a new trailer that was quickly distributed throughout the world. The game, with Kirby Wii as a temporary title, was seen again at E3 2011, with a brand new trailer and a playable demo on the show floor, containing new copy abilities, full 4-player gameplay, and various new powers called super abilities. Originally, the game was supposed to be called Kirby Wii Super Friends, as an emphasis on the super abilities and the main theme of friendship, according to Kumazaki himself, but they instead decided to go with the final title of Hoshino Kabi Wii, or, when translated, Kirby of the Stars Wii, which got changed to Kirby's Adventure Wii in Europe and Australia, and Kirby's Return to Dreamland in the United States. So, before we go over the E3 2011 trailer, let's backpedal a bit to the cancelled Gamecube Kirby game at E3 2005. Despite some aspects of the game being more close to Star Allies like the playable enemies, there are aspects in this cancelled game that would make it into Return to Dreamland. But since we're gonna follow this trailer in order, first up is this enemy that Kirby spikes downward with his sword. Many Kirby fans will recognize that this is a golem from the GBA game, Kirby and the Amazing Mirror. Despite him being fully functional in this trailer, as of the making of this video, this is the first and only time Golem was an enemy in a modern 3D Kirby game, and hasn't appeared in another Kirby game since. Moving right along, we can see Kirby defeating some bonker enemies with his iconic hammer. But the hat for Hammer Kirby is completely different, as it's a yellow hard hat, probably paralleling the real thing construction workers wear. This is a unique hat for Hammer Kirby, as Return to Dreamland decided to keep the Hachimachi inspired headband that past Kirby games have had for years. Despite the yellow hard hat Hammer Kirby not making it into the final game, Hammer Kirby does get a similar type of hard hat in the form of a helmet in his Toy Hammer upgrade in Forbidden Land. It's also important to note that the concept of the hard hat is also very similar to Ranger Kirby's hat in Forbidden Land, such as the fact that it's a hard hat with a leather strap that holds a headlamp. The next shot depicts Water Kirby, who does make it into Return to Dreamland, but the design of Water Kirby is a bit different compared to the final design, as Kirby himself is colored in an opaque bluish color, which might seem familiar to Kirby fans. That's because this design is taken from the 96th episode of the Hoshinakabi anime, or as it's known in the West, Kirby Right Back Atcha. The episode named Air Ride in Style Part 1 shows Kirby slurping up water to become Water Kirby, which has a similar design to the Water Kirby seen in the 2005 trailer. Water Kirby also has a different type of attack where, in this shot, he seems to be blowing a lot of water bubbles into the air that damage enemies. This attack doesn't return in the final game, but the way how Kirby deals this attack, shooting water out of his mouth, does parallel how Water Kirby does his wave attack in the final game. The clip then cuts to Kirby using his helper mechanic to turn his stone ability into a helper golem, just as if this was Kirby Superstar. And speaking of the Super Nintendo game, before Stone Kirby creates a helper golem, notice Stone Kirby himself. It may not be obvious, but this is the very first time players would see the modern Stone Kirby design that would continue on in future Kirby games, as prior games were still using the Stone Kirby design set by Superstar. After Kirby creates a helper golem, he walks along this conveyor belt pathway and inhales this Broom Hatter enemy, which gives him the cleaning ability, a power-up not seen since Kirby's Dreamland 3. While the power-up doesn't appear in Return to Dreamland, it does make its official modern reappearance in Kirby Star Allies on the Nintendo Switch. The clip then jumps to Kirby and his crew fighting a mech, or what would be named the HRD3 in the final game. The design of the mech depicts King DDD's color scheme, and even his logo, which probably means DDD is piloting the mech. While the design doesn't go used in Return to Dreamland, it does make a cameo as a boss in Kirby's Mass Attack. Anyways, we get a glimpse of an unknown Kirby enemy that has never been seen since this trailer. It seems to be a tornado ability type of enemy, as you can see it attack the HRD3 while spinning. Cutting to another part of the clip shows us Kirby and his group going through a level alongside a friendly Bonker, Chili, and Blade Knight as his helpers. But notice this hat on top of Kirby's head? Look familiar? That's because this is an early version of what would become the modern design of Bomb Kirby, and this is even apparent in the trailer, as you can see Kirby attack this Waddle Doo with a bomb. The hat depicts a red or maroon-like color as the base color, with what might be yellow stars dotting around the hat and a blue ribbon on the top. It's almost a complete color swap from the final design, with its dark blue base with multicolored stars and a red ribbon on the top. As for where Kirby got his bomb power-up, we can probably assume it was this enemy seen here. Slowing down the footage, we can see some sort of creature on top of this round ball that pulls out a bomb and attacks. This bomb enemy, which doesn't even have a name, has yet to make an appearance in a released Kirby game, so there's nothing much to say about it. The last thing to note is the music that plays throughout this entire trailer. Let's take a listen. Sounds eerily familiar, right? That's because this song made it into Return to Dreamland as the song Road to Victory that plays in the arena minigame with virtually no major changes. Here, let's compare the two. Okay, let's take a look at a clip that captured another Kirby GameCube trailer that was shown off on the E3 show floor. It's only about 9 seconds long, but it gives us a better depiction of the story, as well as some levels not seen in the previous trailer. For one, the very first thing we can see is Kirby and his friends fighting on some sort of stairway. We can see via the stage in the back that this is some sort of stairway relating to King Dedede, which might be the path before the HRD3 boss fight we saw in the previous trailer. The trailer then cuts to Kirby and his friends platforming on the side of some sort of battleship, possibly Mennonite's battleship Halberd. While it is true that the Halberd was featured in Squeak Squad as a level, and even took part in the final boss fight in Planet Robobot, as of the making of this video, it has yet to make its appearance as a level in a 3D or even 2.5D Kirby game, making this part of the trailer a glimpse into what a 3D Battleship Halberd level might look like. The one thing that makes this trailer special though, is this part here, where it looks like King Dedede is stealing the Warp Star to power the HRD3. This clip is the only video confirmation of an actual story in some capacity, and verifies that it is in fact King Dedede who was the pilot of the mech, and that the Warp Star was stolen to be used as a power source. Last thing to note is the music of the trailer, as it's another song that makes it into Return to Dreamland later down the line. The track Rocky Area in Return to Dreamland has an identical part of its track that sounds like the song in this trailer. Here, let's take a listen. Finally, believe it or not, some concept art has been released to the public of the GameCube Kirby game. These pieces of artwork can be found in the Kirby 20th Anniversary Encyclopedia, but since the book was only released in Japan, the book hasn't been officially or even fan translated, so I can't really understand what much of the text says on this page about the Kirby GameCube game. However, we can look at the few pieces of concept art that was put on this page, first of which being this ominous enemy who may have been the concept of the final boss. This may or may not be an early version of Magolor, but the overall look and feel of the boss does parallel Magolor's final form in the final game. Next to him on the right is a concept art of a classic green field level with some hills. Maybe an early idea of Cookie Country. Below that are two pictures depicting another concept art of a beach level and a huge squid with a ship on its head. The concept art for the level has similar aspects to levels in Onion Ocean, such as the reef theme and the bending trees, and the huge squid would end up as Huge Flotso in the final game. Though the early Huge Flotso is designed to be more threatening because it has a beak for a mouth and two tentacles coming out of it. Below that is perhaps some sort of train level, or maybe even a train boss of some sort, since what I can assume to be the engine of the train looks like a human head with teeth. On the right side of the page are three more pieces of concept art, one of which depicts various variations of the bomb enemy we saw at E3 2005, alongside other possible enemies. To the right hand bottom of it depicts concept art of the Dedede HRD3, showing off its innards and even the supposed warp star that would have powered the mech. This concept art is my personal favorite, as it's a depiction of possibly the main menu of the game. The layout of this menu is, in my opinion, the most chaotic menu I've ever seen in a Kirby game, and resembles the Superstar menu layout, except with many more choices as you can see. Although we do have a translation of the Japanese text in the text box in the concept art, keep in mind that this translation is coming from a blogger who managed to get their hands on a physical version of the book and reverse translated the text, so it's unofficial and may or may not be one-to-one. When translating the text in the text box into English, the text reads, "Save Kirby. Kirby was captured by Dedede. Control a helper to rescue Kirby." This seems to indicate that a controllable helper mode was planned for the game, which would have been a first for the Kirby series at the time. Obviously, the mode did not make it into Return to Dreamland, but other Kirby games would incorporate it, as Superstar Ultra would have the helper to hero mode, and even Star Allies has a similar mode called Guest Star ? Star Allies Go. Let's fast forward to 2011 to the trailer that was dropped at the Financial Relations meeting. Even though the trailer seems very close to its final counterpart, there are some details that are different in this version of the game. For one, various parts of the game's HUD are bordered in a black outline, compared to the final game's HUD, which has different colors for each status bar. Kirby's life counter icon would be changed to a pink outline, the lower star cutter would have a gray outline, and the star icon would have a yellow-brownish outline. Also, the top left HUDs have this transparent gray backing to them, which changes from white or nothing at all. The life counter and star counter would have this backing removed entirely, while the lower star cutter icon and the energy sphere counter would have a solid white color for its backing. The energy sphere icons themselves are also completely missing in this version of the game, which might mean that they haven't been collected or even implemented yet. Kirby's health bar also has this star on the left bottom of the Kirby icon, and it does have a mechanic. Kind of. I'll talk about it once we get to E3 2011. So it's a noted difference, but nothing significant can be said about it at the moment. What can be noted in the HUD is the sword Kirby icon next to the health bar. It's designed in a different manner with the cap portion sticking all the way up, as opposed to its final design of having the top of the hat droop down towards the side. When Kirby passes by this tutorial sign, a sound effect can be heard as the sign acknowledges the player making Kirby run. This sound effect sounds lower pitched compared to its final counterpart. Here, take a listen. Most objects that are breakable with the Ultra Sword ability are signified with a star graphic on the object, except for this pillar which, as Kirby cuts it, is missing that same star graphic. And in this clip, Kirby is busy traversing through one of the Another Dimension levels, and the purple wall that pushes you along the level catches up to him. Now, as soon as Kirby swallows all of the Waddle Dees, the blocking stones, and the 1-up, notice the wall with what seems to be some sort of yellow thing inside the purple wall slowly creeping up on Kirby. It's said that this is an unknown creature within the wall, but I have another theory as to what it might be. If we take a look at the final game, you can see within the wall a purple star texture with a black hole. Now, if we pay attention to the edges of the star and imagine if this star was yellow instead of purple, it's very similar in shape to the yellow thing in the financial relations video. You can even see hints of the purple black hole texture as this purple color spins upwards within the yellow object. So, in my opinion, this thing in the wall is actually the black hole star, but the color of the star was just yellow instead of purple. But again, this is just my theory, because I could be wrong as we never see the entire wall in full. Moving right along, the next clip shows us Leaf Kirby using a sparkler to blow up his enemies with cannonballs. Leaf Kirby himself has an icon next to the health meter that is a bit different with smaller darker green leaves for the headpiece. Now, it's also said that the gem is a bit smaller than the finals gem on the headpiece, but the footage is so blurry that it might not be obvious, but trust me, there's a gem on Leaf Kirby that's smaller than the final gem. We've arrived at the last clip with Water Kirby now looking like his final game counterpart. Again, the icon next to the health bar is different with Water Kirby's dome having a continuous curve, while the final game has a design that's more wavy and has shades of darker blue in its design. The room that Kirby is in is also different as this room doesn't have any enemies in the final game and also leads to the Raisin Ruins boss fight. Okay, let's head to E3 2011 to check out that trailer that Nintendo dropped on their press release website and some gameplay that was recorded on the show floor itself. With the trailer, the game is looking to be basically completed with even full 3D cutscenes. If you look closely though, there are some minor kinks that still need to be ironed out, such as the fact that, as Kirby runs away from King Dedede and Bandana D here, his mouth is in a closed position, while the final game has this happy expression as he runs away. There also seems to be a lack of flowers in the field, as the final game has a bunch of flowers scattered about the area. When they come to a halt, and Kirby drops this cake in the cutscene, the strawberry and icing doesn't tumble off and sticks to it. As the crew are about to board the Lore Star Cutter for the first time, notice the ship and how it's pointing to the right, and also notice the position of King Dedede and Bandana D. In the final game, the entire video was flipped, as the ship now points to the left, and Dedede and Bandana D are now in swapped positions. It's my guess, but I think they flipped the video to be more in line with what the in-game Lore Star Cutter looks like, as the game has it facing it towards the left instead of the right. As the trailer cuts to actual gameplay, this version of the game is still using the same HUD seen in the financial relations meeting, but now we can finally get a look at the early icon for the energy sphere, which are a bit less detailed and have this white outline around them. The final would color the outlines gray instead of white. Most of the copy ability icons look essentially the same, with minor changes, such as the cutter hat having wings that curve outward, or the stone hat having a bigger orange block in the middle. The one ability that has the biggest change is the Ultra Sword hat, which, just like the regular sword hat, has the top of the hat sticking up instead of looping to the side. Due to this angle, the end part at the top of the hat doesn't resemble a star at all, whereas the final game's hat has it at an angle that makes it look like a star. Continuing on in the trailer, it seems that this pillar is still missing that star icon for indicating it's breakable with the Ultra Sword ability. But what's new here is the super meter, as it's a bit different. The border around the meter is shaded a bit differently, and the star at the end is less detailed with no border around it. As Kirby fights Mr. Duder here, notice how Mr. Duder's name isn't on his health bar, and we just get the generic name of Boss. This text was probably put as a placeholder since every boss in this trailer and the E3 2011 demo has this name. This scene depicts Kirby just having opened a new portal to another dimension, and tries to go in as Leaf Kirby. Remember when I said that there was a smaller gem on Leaf Kirby some time ago? Well, you can take a look at it here in full clarity, and it almost blends into the leaves because it's so small. The portal to another dimension itself has its swirls around the portal missing the stars, which make it less detailed. The inside of the portal is also colored in a yellow-purplish mix, compared to the final version where the entire portal was a dark purple. As Kirby jumps into the portal, he just has a lack of any expression as he's sucked into it, compared to the final version where he has a mouth open indicating a more shocked appearance. Inside another dimension, there's only one thing that we can take note here, and that is this sign. As Kirby follows its direction to inhale all these stone blocks, it gives a circle instead of a checkmark as its pass sign. This circle sign indicates that the localization team hasn't completely finished their work, as this sign is used in the Japanese and Korean versions of Return to Dreamland, but it gets replaced by a checkmark in all other versions. As Kirby shows off his new whip copy ability, he gets joined in by a second player playing as Meta Knight. Before Meta Knight joins in though, the character selection has his name grayed out, and his icon is surrounded by white arrows, as opposed to the not grayed out name and blue arrows in the final game. As Meta Knight appears here, he just pops right in without the screen darkening while playing an animation. This lack of the animation also doesn't make it obvious that Meta Knight took away a life from the life counter, which might be the reason why they incorporated the animation in the final game. Finally, despite the actual playable model having the bandana, Bandana D's icon is missing his iconic bandana in this version of the game. Okay, let's move on to actual gameplay that was filmed on the show floor. As the demo starts, we can see an early title screen with the Kirby Wii logo from the trailer, alongside selection of Level 1 and 2. This game build is probably using a more recent version, as indicated by the health icons at the bottom of the screen. Bandana D's icon in particular verifies this. However, the game still doesn't play an animation when a player joins in. Backing up a bit, we can also see here that players could highlight the same character when choosing what character to play as. The final game doesn't allow this, although we don't know if players can choose the same character, as this nor any other footage that I could find doesn't have players that even attempt at choosing the same character. As the players keep on trudging through the level, the one playing as DDD gets trapped in a Pacto and takes some hits. We can see in the health meter that there's a little orange hit marker next to the player icon, which doesn't appear in the final game. Fast forwarding a bit, it seems that whoever is playing as Bandana D has taken too much damage as their health bar indicates low health and the player icon is sweating. But remember when I said that the star has a small mechanic? Well, it seems that when the player would be low on health, the small star next to the player icon would start blinking. Since the star itself doesn't return in the final game, this mechanic was removed entirely. As the demo continues, they get to the point where Ultra Sword Kirby has to cut some pillars in order to drop some platforms. The Meta Knight player gets himself accidentally killed due to the terrain dropping right on top of him. But listen closely to the death sound when Meta Knight loses a life. Did you notice it? Well, the death jingle that plays is the full version of the death jingle that usually plays when the first player dies. In the final game, when a player other than the first player dies, it plays a shorter version of the jingle instead. And it isn't only tied to Meta Knight, as another video also has King Dedede lose a life, and it plays the same jingle. Speaking of players losing a life, the last thing that the gameplay footage shows us is when Kirby himself loses a life, the player icon has a different icon that has open eyes instead of closed eyes in the final. In fact, this icon seems to be directly inspired from Kirby Superstar Ultra, as the design is basically identical to the one used in that game. Finally, I'd like to go over several pieces of concept art that was drawn up when designing the character of Magolor. These pieces of concept art could be found in the Kirby Art and Style Collection Artbook, which contains the artworks of many different Kirby games up until Kirby Battle Royale. First up is this entirely different version of Magolor that doesn't even resemble the final version. The concept art also notes that the Master Crown given to Magolor in the game was designed to be a mask at first, and that this crowned version of him has what is described to be as glowing letters that look like circuitry. Next to it is another different version of Magolor that looks nothing like his final version, but the design does have a heavy influence in the creation of President Haltman in Planet Robobot. It's noted that the clothing and handcuffs have a gear design, and that the underside of the cape of normal Magolor has the same pattern as a Sphere Doomer's skin. Here's a concept of Magolor looking more closer to his final counterpart, though there are some differences. For one, regular Magolor has a full robe that is colored purple and yellow, and one of his horns seems to have some sort of chain or earring hanging off the side, with a star-shaped charm at the end. For his true form here, it's noted that they already planned for Magolor to attack with rings of magic light, and that the ring's skirtish part of the design would flash and move around. Magolor's final form has 3 pieces of artwork in the book that each contain an aspect that influences the final design. This early design has a crown that transforms into wings, while the second piece of art is a bit more elaborate with the crown decorating the entire body, as stated by the little note in the corner. The third piece of art depicts the final form being a flipped version of the true form, and now has the added in energy rings that hold the arms. It's also stated that his eyes can charge up energy and fire a big laser, something that does make it into the final game's boss fight. The last concept art is this sketch, which, in my opinion, is the most interesting. This seems to be a sketch of a final boss that is a female character, possibly a female Magolor, as the book states. Though, and this is just my speculation, considering that the sketch is just a sketch, and the other pieces of concept art are fully colorized, this could have been a very early concept before the final design of Magolor was solidified. But I could be wrong, as that's not exactly enough evidence to justify the theory in total, and the sketch could have been made on the side, or perhaps even forgotten about until the creation of this book. That was about all the differences that I could find in the concept art and trailers, so I'd say it's time to inhale and copy some of those game files to see what was left out. And as per usual, if you want to take a look at the stuff that I don't talk about in this video, such as the different colored hitboxes, or the list of many unused maps still within the game, there'll be links in the description below. Before we start though, I'd like to give a little disclaimer. I'll be showcasing stuff put on both the cutting room floor and the Kirby Wiki website, as the wiki does contain a lot of leftover content that, as of the making of this video, the cutting room floor currently doesn't have. But for the sake of making the video flow better, I'll be combining the content of both websites under different categories. Now with that out of the way, let's start with some unused cutscenes relating to the destruction and reconstruction of the Lore Star Cutter. The first cutscene is the opening where the Lore Star Cutter enters Dreamland through a portal and loses its parts. As we can see on the bottom right hand screen, the video is titled Prototype Movie OP, with the OP part probably meaning opening. The cutscene itself is missing some effects that add flair and make it more impactful. Like for example, the screen doesn't shake a tiny bit whenever a major part of the ship falls off. The cutscene is also playing the song Infinite Power throughout the entire cutscene. Other than those differences though, the cutscene is very identical to the final. The next cutscene is named Prototype Movie ED, with the ED part probably meaning ending. The entire cutscene contains the Lore Star Cutter floating in the darkness, with its missing parts reassembling themselves to the ship piece by piece, via lightning effects, which actually get used in various cutscenes in the final game. Afterwards, it shows off the ship in full detail with several exterior shots, and then crossfades to black to a "To Be Continued" screen. The final cutscene is just the previous unused cutscene with more added effects and editing to it. The cutscene starts with a 3, 2, 1 countdown, and then cuts to the Lore Star Cutter floating in the void again. But it's a bit more detailed this time around, as the void has a faint purple tone to it, and the streaks that go by are more pronounced and noticeable. The cutscene ends when the ship is entirely assembled, and, as you might have noticed, the HAL Laboratory Inc. logo is on the top left of the screen. Next, let's cover some unused models. The first model we'll take a look at is this door. The door is just the same door you find in the game, except, well, it's golden. It also has one animation file that makes it glisten. Nothing too exciting here. The next model is of this crystal snowflake-ish object, internally named Ice Blizzard. The model is located within the files for the Spear Doomers that are ice-based, and have an animation file that also makes them glisten. This was probably the remnants of an unused attack the Spear Doomers were going to do at some point. Speaking of unused attacks, the next model we have in the files is this weird black blob. The internal name for this model is named Bubble, and, most importantly, is located in the files for the boss fight against Magolor. The location of the file makes it clear that Magolor was supposed to use this in some capacity during his boss fight, and has two animation files of it inflating and deflating. Finally, there's a nearly functioning unused enemy within the files of Return to Dreamland. The enemy is internally named Herebell, which seems to be a flower-based enemy and contains full animation files of it waiting, attacking, and chewing. The chewing animation in particular indicates that this enemy could be a variation of the Pacto enemies seen in the final game, as Pactos act similar to how they attack players. Let's go over the plethora of audio files left over within the game, some of which are sound effects, while a majority of them are music tracks. Now, a lot of unused tracks are actually earlier versions of already existing songs. A few of them, though, sound like they used a lower sound font that make it have a retro feel. Besides the sound font though, these tracks don't have any big changes compared to the final versions, but I'll let you take a listen to both versions of some of the songs to hear the little differences. Let's move on to the more interesting audio files now. First off, are some unused death screams for when you defeat Magolor, internally named M1 Danmantu 01 and M2 Danmantu 02. Here, take a listen. Interestingly, the used versions of Magolor's Death Cry have the same abbreviations for their file names. The tracks named Super Copy Boss 1, Super Copy Boss 2, and Super Copy Boss 6 are unused variations of the theme used when you use the super abilities against the Grand Doomer. While the final game has a plunkier sound font, these unused variations include more distinct string instruments, something that you can barely hear in the final versions of the songs. Considering that all versions sound nearly identical to each other, I'm going to let you guys listen to only Super Copy Boss 2 and the final version of the song as a comparison. Here, take a listen. The tracks Super C Copy Break and Super C Copy Break 3 are grouped with each other and were most likely going to be used for when Kirby entered a portal to another dimension. The first track has a very foreboding composition and tone to it, which is possibly the reason why it wasn't used. Break 3 has a more cheerful tone to it and sounds similar to the one used in-game, except that it's using the same instrumentation as the track Fanfare GCK, which I will get to in a bit. The track named KBYW He-Iti-1 is an unused fast and cheerful song that has similarities to Prison Plains from Kirby's Squeak Squad and Slide Area in Return to Dreamland. Let's take a listen. IUK-LP-DDD3 is an unused song that might sound familiar to Kirby fans. Let's give it a listen first. For those of you who might have not recognized it, this track is taken straight from the Super Famicom game Kirby no Kira Kira Kids, better known as Kirby Superstar Stacker in the West. This track is the theme for DDD in that game, and thus, it's believed that this track would have played for Robo DDD in the Scope Shot minigame. The last of the unused tracks is the track named Fanfare GCK, which is the most interesting unused track in the game in my opinion. But first, let's take a listen. The instrumentation gives off a very Kirby Air Ride or even a Super Smash Bros. Melee vibe to it, and even the file name itself suggests that the track is actually a leftover from the cancelled GameCube Kirby game. Return to Dreamland uses different variations and versions of this song, but if this specific version sounds eerily familiar to you, that's because this unused version of the song would be reused in the 3DS Kirby games and even in Kirby Star Allies. Now we're getting into the more interesting leftover content. Next up are some unused textures for various enemies, characters, and objects. There are various lower quality versions of the icons for the copyability challenge doors located in the texture files for Hal Candle Armor-D. While most of these challenge door icons do make it into the final game, there's one texture that doesn't. It seems that a challenge door was planned for the ninja copyability, but was eventually scrapped for whatever reason. An image can be found inside a folder for the tutorial windows that pop up in the Cookie Country levels. It explains how Kirby's inhale ability works, but the more important aspect is that the artwork actually comes from the artwork created for Kirby's Nightmare in Dreamland. The enemy called Wolf, who makes its first appearance in Return to Dreamland, has an early texture within its own files. The early texture depicts simpler pupils, and no blue band covering its head. The color of the shell is also in a light blue compared to the darker blue used in the final game. The enemies Cappy, Krabby, Hothead, and Waddle-Doo all have unused hurt textures. These textures were supposed to show up whenever the enemy would be damaged or grabbed, but go unused for some reason. The textures would eventually be reused in Kirby Triple Deluxe for the same reason, although HAL Laboratory did slightly modify them in that game. The mini-boss Goliath has an unused texture that depicts him with red fur and a darker skin tone. The files for this texture could be found in both the regular and EX versions of Goliath, so we're not really sure what version of Goliath was going to have this texture. Interestingly, the names for the textures have the name of Tamarin in their file names. Wispy Woods has an unused texture that makes him more cartoony looking. These textures for his body and leaves depict a more cartoony art style, and aren't compatible with his model at all. It's presumed that these textures could have been leftovers from one of the Gamecube prototypes, considering they aren't compatible with Wispy's current model and look completely different to the final game's textures. Within Bomb Kirby's files is a surprise for older Kirby fans. This is an unused texture for Bomb Kirby's hat, and if you recognize the colors, that's because the textures depict the older Superstar-inspired Bomb Kirby hat. We don't exactly know if this is a leftover from the GameCube development days, because, as I've already shown off before, that version of the game was already using a different hat altogether. This texture also doesn't work with the standard Bomb Kirby hat in-game, so it's unknown when this texture was implemented into the game itself. Within the HRD3's files are two textures that are very special. One of these textures is a texture for a Warp Star, while the other obviously depicts the textures for King Dedede. These are the textures for the Warp Star and King Dedede that was seen in the GameCube Kirby trailer that was shown on the E3 2005 show floor. This can be even verified in the location for these files itself, and the texture for the playable version of King Dedede is different than this one. Next up are the plethora of unused animations for playable characters, regular enemies, and mini-bosses. Let's work our way backward and start with the mini-bosses first. The mini-bosses, Gigant Edge and Kibbleblade, have unused flinching animations, while Kibbleblade also has an added struggling animation. These bosses don't flinch at all when being hit with a strong attack, so the animations go unused. However, future Kirby games re-implement the flinching mechanic for these bosses, so these animations were reworked into those games. The enemies Broom Hatters and regular and Halcandron versions of the Waddle Dees all have animations for sliding on slopes. These animations go unused, as neither of these enemies have the ability to slide on slopes. Poppy Bros Jr. has a lot of animations that relate to it being able to walk and even ride its own bomb. It even has an unused idle animation that you don't see in-game. While it is true that he doesn't move at all in this game, Poppy Bros Jr. would be able to move again in Kirby Star Allies. If you ever played Star Allies, these animations of Poppy Bros Jr. riding and jumping on his bomb might look familiar to you. That's because the idea would be incorporated into Marx's moveset, as the ability to ride on top of his ball is very similar to the animations of Poppy Bros Jr. riding the bomb. Sir Kibble has an unused walking animation, something that he hasn't been able to do since Kirby Squeak Squad, but he was given the ability to walk again later in modern Kirby games, including Kirby and the Forgotten Land. The most odd unused animation for all of the enemies, in my opinion, are the unused ones for Scarfy. Supposedly, these animations are of Scarfy jumping. Now, if you've ever played a Kirby game before, I'm pretty sure I don't need to explain why these animations are out of place. So it's extremely strange why Scarfy, an enemy that floats, needed animations for it to jump. Both Naughty and Kaboo have animations for abilities they lost once they were brought into Return to Dreamland. Naughty has this unused walking animation, while Kaboo has an animation that makes it look like it's teleporting. Both of these animations don't go used in Return to Dreamland, but were replicated in Forbidden Land, as Naughty and Kaboo were given back these skills. The freezing enemy Chili has an unused animation for it jumping in the air. This seems like another random jumping animation, but it does have ties to the Kirby GameCube game, as you can spot Chili jumping in the trailer. And it's not like the animation goes completely unused, as Chili can jump in Kirby Star Allies. Finally, let's go over the leftover animation files for the playable characters, starting with Meta Knight. Meta Knight has a bunch of unused animations, but let's start with this unused idle animation first. This animation makes Meta Knight sit down and examine his sword, perhaps an early version of one of his final animations, where he does a similar thing except standing up. More interestingly, there are 5 unused animations called Sodori Attack Air Start, Sodori Attack Air, Sodori Attack Air End, Sodori Attack End, and Sodori Attack Start. These animations just have Meta Knight copy several of Galacta Knight's animations, with some of them having long pauses or startups before the animation plays. It's also worth noting that the name Sodori in the animation file name is an enemy within Return to Dreamland, but Meta Knight nor Galacta Knight have nothing to do with this enemy, so it's strange why these animation files are named that. King Dedede has 2 unused animation files, one of which I'm kind of wondering why it never got implemented. But let's start off with this animation named Top L. This is essentially a modified copy of the animation he has while riding Landia. Nothing special really. However, the animation named Wheel Hammer Swing consists of him doing a wheel attack underwater with his hammer. The final game just lets him swing his hammer right in front of him underwater, like his regular attack. And per the trend that has formed already, this attack does get used in Kirby Star Allies when you play as Dedede, and is much better than the single hammer swing underwater in my opinion. Finally, being the hero and main star of the game, the pink puffball has a lot of unused animation files that relate to several different copy abilities. Let's start with just normal Kirby first though. Like Broom Hatter and the Waddle Dees, Kirby has a bunch of slope sliding animations within his files. He also has a bunch of files where he teeters on the edge of something, including ones where he teeters when having something in his mouth, and one where he teeters while having the parasol copy ability. Finally, Kirby has a bunch of animation files of him hanging or dangling on a rope, something that he can't really climb in the final game. Okay, now for the copy abilities. Let's start off with Beam Kirby, as it's the one with the most unused animations. Many of these animation files are early animations of attacks that are already within the game, such as an early Revolution Beam, some sort of chargeable Cycle Beam, and even an unused attack where he sticks the wand up into the sky. These unused attack animations make it look like this was going to be some sort of attack that goes upwards, or perhaps an attack that covered Kirby somehow. Bomb Kirby has a bunch of unused throwing animations, one of which has ties to the Kirby Gamecube game. These animation files are all of Kirby throwing bombs in various circumstances, but look completely different to their final counterparts. This specific animation in particular, where Kirby is throwing a bomb in mid-air, is very similar to the animation seen in the Gamecube Kirby game trailer. Ninja Kirby has two animation files where he misses the grab for his airdrop move. These animation files go unused, possibly because if you miss the move in the final game, it activates another move entirely, so there was no need for these animations in the first place. Spear Kirby has a set of animation files that make him do some sort of downward spinning attack with the spear. It's interesting to note that the animation files look eerily similar to Kirby's down smash in the Smash Bros. Series. Tornado Kirby has an unused animation that makes him dizzy after he does his attack. He also has a test animation that merges both the standard tornado attack animation and the dizzy one. It's possible this animation file was not needed, or perhaps this was seen as an inconvenience, as players would have to wait before Kirby stopped being dizzy. Finally, let's talk about the unused copy ability and two super abilities left within the coding for the game. There's an unused copy ability graphic within the files for the ability stars that Kirby creates after discarding a copy ability, and it seems to depict a clock. There's even a super ability star variant of the texture. While the logical conclusion is that this was supposed to be some sort of time-based copy ability, according to Japanese blogger Nulog, these textures are actually the default textures for the copy ability star. Kirby can't really discard a copy ability without, well, having one in the first place, so this texture goes completely unused because of that fact. Two copy abilities were originally going to have super ability versions, Spark and Cutter. The only indication for Super Spark's existence is its texture, as its data was overwritten with the files for Ultra Sword. It's interesting to note though, that the color for the Super Spark texture is green, as opposed to regular Spark's color of blue. This color actually matches the copy ability of Plasma, which, in Return to Dreamland, doesn't appear, but several of Spark's abilities are taken from Plasma, such as an arrow you can shoot after charging just a little bit. Super Carter has a lot more files left over within the game in comparison. There's the texture for the ability star, 3D models of the hat and the cutter weapon itself, the HUD texture that would have gone over Kirby's texture on the health bar, and even several animations of Kirby charging and throwing the weapon, all located within Kirby's own files. It's theorized that this was scrapped early in development, as there's no indication of a Super Sir Kibble type of enemy that would have given you the ability, as well as the fact that it would have acted very similar to Ultra Sword. So those were the beta files of Kirby's Return to Dreamland. With the long and arduous time it took to develop this game, to the point where it skips an entire console generation, it's not surprising to believe that many changes and concepts were scrapped or left over before we got the final result. The team at HAL Laboratory were trying to create a game that would not only be fun, but also surpass the fans' expectations compared to the last console Kirby game. I won't deny that I and many fans would have liked to seen a GameCube Kirby game come into fruition, or perhaps other mechanics that didn't make it into the final game, such as the Super Cutter or Super Spark ability. However, we can take some solace in the fact that some mechanics or scrapped ideas would make it into future Kirby games, some of which have become future titles. Return to Dreamland, though, in my eyes, will always be the game that's remembered for its multiplayer mayhem, cool and power super abilities, and the game that returned Kirby back to the home console scene after so many years in hiatus. With that being said, my name's NinFan237, and I'll see you guys next time.